My name's Rob, and I've been tasked with introducing your two lecturers for this evening. Just some housekeeping things. If everybody could just turn their cell phones off if they have them, just so it doesn't interrupt the proceedings. I cannot turn the volume up. That guy can turn the volume up. All right. And you don't want me to get too close. Okay, all right. So anyway, if everybody could turn their cell phones off. Also, they're going to be filming tonight's event, but just so you know, the audience will not show up in the frame. Only the speakers will. There's also washrooms back and to the right if you need them during the session. And there'll be questions at the conclusion for about 15 minutes after each speaker. And there's a microphone right there that you can come up and ask your question. If you're too shy, you can come over and see me and write it down on a piece of paper, and I can ask on your behalf if you don't want to come up to the microphone. So anyway, the question is, I've been tasked to introduce the speakers, but why am I here? I really want to know, with the proliferation of wireless devices, including 5G, I think it'll make prudent avoidance of these technologies virtually impossible while still living in a city. And is essentially, in my mind, a massive experiment, which is mandatory and non-consensual for the people that are part of it. And it's basically for the profit of big corporations. And we have too many historical examples of where something was promoted as beneficial or healthy, like DDT, asbestos, cigarettes, thalidomide, and lead. And I'm old enough to remember when we used to put lead in gasoline, we used to put lead in paint, and we all thought that was a good idea until there was enough time that went by to realize that, geez, maybe there's some health problems with this. We had industry that was making too much money putting lead in gasoline, but we continued to do it until the science was definitive. But those of us who wanted to avoid it was very difficult because there was no way to avoid something that was pumped out into our atmosphere 24/7 every time someone started a car. So anyway, I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Martin Pall, Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry and Basic Medical Sciences in the School of Molecular Biosciences at Washington State University. Dr. Pall is an international recognized expert on the science behind 5G. His groundbreaking review articles show the mechanism by which human-generated electromagnetic frequencies cause biological and health effects. Thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Let me thank you all for coming here. We're all facing this together, and all of us need all the help we can get. So I'm going to be talking about three things. I'm going to be talking about the safety guidelines and how they fail to predict biological effects and therefore fail to produce safety. I'm going to be talking about 5G and why it will be much more dangerous than the electromagnetic fields, the EMFs that we're already exposed to. And I'm also going to be talking about the fact that the fields we're already exposed to are having already very profound health impacts on us and on, of course, in the environment, on many other organisms. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. Now, as a scientist, I don't like to spout out things and say, hey, this is the way it is. What I want you to do is to get a feel for what kind of evidence we have on these things and how extensive it is. So some of the things I'm going to talk about will probably go over your heads, but some of it will not. And let me just say, we scientists have a little secret we don't talk about very often. And that is, we rarely understand everything about the scientific papers that we read. But what's true is that we get very good at telling in determining what we do understand and what the importance is, what that importance is of what we do understand. So I'm going to ask you to try to do the same thing, okay? Some things will go over your head, that's okay. But really look for what you do understand here and why it's important. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the safety guidelines. And what you'll see here, all of the safety guidelines, whether you talk about Canada Safety Code 6 or the US FCC safety guidelines or the ICNIRP safety guidelines, which is where they all started, which is what I'm showing here. And the ICNIRP safety guidelines are essentially identical to the EU safety guidelines, the UK safety guidelines, the Australian safety guidelines, and many others. So they're all very, very similar to each other. And they're entirely based on average exposures, averaged over either 6 minutes or 30 minutes. And you can see these are all averaged over 6 minutes. See that? And the allowable levels are based on what's called SAR. SAR stands for specific absorption rates, which is a measure of heating. So they're all based on how active the fields are in heating our tissues. And because of that, they only protect us from thermal effects, from heating effects. They do not protect us from non-thermal effects, and that's a huge problem. And there have been many statements from scientists and physicians expressing high-level concern about the safety guidelines because they do not take into consideration non-thermal effects. Now, if you look at this, there are already sort of some rather strange things about this. The occupational exposures are about 5 times higher than the general public exposures, even though people in the occupations rarely have any control over the effects, over their exposures, or over the effects in their body. So they are all much more affected. And the other thing that's even stranger about this is that partial body exposures are allowable at much higher levels than whole body exposures. Now, one of the things that's strange about that is we know that many of these effects occur at the level of individual cells. The individual cells don't care whether they're exposed in the whole body or whether they're exposed just in part of the body. But here you have 25 times higher levels allowable here and 50 times higher allowable levels there, and it really makes no sense. Okay. Well, okay. What I'm going to talk about are the tests of these. Okay. Now, right at the core of the scientific method is the following: you have a theory. The theory makes predictions, and you then test whether those predictions are valid or not, right? And if the predictions are not valid, what do? You throw the theory out, right? That's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at predictions of the safety guidelines and ask, do they make predictions that are correct? And what you'll see here is over and over and over again, they do not make correct predictions, okay? And yet we're still stuck with these safety guidelines. Okay, so one of the things about these is that what you can see here is that pulsed EMFs, and let me say all wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations. So pulsed EMFs are things that go up and down rapidly, and the wireless communication devices, that's what carries the information, are the pulsations. And what these review articles show, 13 of them, is that pulsed EMFs are in most cases much more biologically active and therefore much more damaging than are non-pulsed EMFs of the same average intensity. So what does that tell you? It tells you immediately average intensities do not predict effects, right? So we've immediately found that the safety guidelines don't work. So that's one thing, and the second thing is that because these wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations, and the smarter they are, the more they pulse, therefore the more dangerous they are. And 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed, much more highly pulsed than anything else that we've ever been exposed to. And therefore, I expect it to be vastly more dangerous as a consequence of that. Okay? So, So let's go on here. Here's another study of pulsations. And so these are nanosecond pulses. Nanosecond pulses are defined as pulses that are between 1 nanosecond and 1 microsecond. Okay? So between 10 to the minus 9 seconds and 10 to the minus 6 seconds. And what's been shown in many, many studies is that these nanoseconds produce effects. And, of various sorts. And we'll talk about some of the effects later on. And so if you take a typical 40 nanosecond pulse and you average it over 6 minutes, you're averaging it over 10 billion times longer. Think about that. 10 billion times longer. What does that do? It decreases the average intensity by a factor of 10 billion. And what do the safety guidelines do? They tell you it cannot produce effects. But they do. Over and over and over again. So the safety guidelines are, again, completely bogus. They do not work. Now, I have an example here of the same kind of false logic that's being used by the health authorities, including Health Canada, in this. Let's assume that I'm afraid I'm going to be shot by a high-powered rifle bullet going over 700 meters a second. That rifle bullet takes about 50 microseconds to tear my body apart. And I go to the health authorities and I say, I'm afraid this is going to be really damaging, right? And then they come back and they say, well, you don't really need to worry about it because if you average it, the force on your body over 10 billion times longer, which happens to be about 75 days, there can't be an effect. Right? Now, if they were to tell you that, which is basically what Health Canada is talking about with regard to these pulsations, what would you do? You'd say, well, these people are either completely incompetent or completely corrupt or both. And that's tragically exactly the appropriate response to the regulatory agencies with regard to the EMFs. So let's go to another thing that also has to do with nanosecond pulses. If you have pairs of nanosecond pulses that occur within a few microseconds of each other, what's been shown is you get super additive effects. That is, they act much more than just the sum of the two individual effects added together. Okay. And that, again, is something that is not predicted by the safety guidelines. Now, what's also true is, but these two pulses have to be of identical polarity, and I'll explain to you what that means in a minute. If, on the other hand, the second pulse has the opposite polarity of the first pulse, it actually decreases the effect of the first pulse. You get much lower effects than the first pulse alone. Okay? Now, you look at that and you say, well, that's not predicted by the safety guidelines either. What does this tell? So what does this tell you about these EMFs? First of all, these EMFs are averaged in the safety guidelines as if they were scalars. What's a scalar? A scalar is something that has intensity but no direction. But EMFs, in fact, are directional and they have polarity. They are actually vectors. Vectors are things that have direction, and they have polarity. Polarity has to do with the direction of the electrical vibrations. And so, if you get polarity in this direction, you get one effect, and if you get polarity in the other direction, as you can see, it has the opposite effect here. So they are averaging this they're using false physics here to calculate their average intensities. So the safety guidelines, which claim to have the physics on their side, in fact, do not have the physics on their side. Okay, so that's another thing, another fatal flaw in the safety guidelines. There are three more fatal flaws I'm going to talk about here. One is that there are what have been called exposure windows, and these are specific intensity ranges where you get maximum effects. So a certain range of intensities, you get maximum effects. And when you go to either lower intensities or higher intensities, they drop way down. Okay? What does that tell you? It tells you you've got these incredibly complex what are called dose-response curves, and you simply cannot predict them based on a simple model like the safety guidelines. It also tells you that it makes no sense to average these. Why? Because you only average things when they have linear dose-response curves. It only makes sense to average them if you have linear, and this is grossly nonlinear. These are not only nonlinear, they're non-monotone. That is, they don't always increase with increasing exposure. They don't always decrease with decreasing exposure. So these things are fundamentally almost completely unpredictable. And therefore, when you try to use safety guidelines based on a simple model, they simply do not work. Okay, so that's another kind of flaw in the safety guidelines. There's a third one here. There's another one here. When you've had individual research groups studying different kinds of cells, different biological cells, different human cells or different animal cells, and using identical methodologies, it's found that the cells behave very differently from each other. What does that tell you? It tells you you have to consider the biological impacts on specific cells. But the safety guidelines completely ignore this. Okay? So again, the safety guidelines massively fail. Okay? And you cannot ignore the biology. This is clear from these findings. And so again, they fail. Okay, and there are also frequency windows, very, very specific frequencies that produce effects orders of magnitude below where you have to be with other frequencies that are nearby. These are thought to be due to resonance interactions with specific targets. Okay, so we have evidence that there are specific targets that are involved in producing these effects, and of course the safety guidelines completely ignore that. They just look at heating. All right, so every time you look, they fail and fail massively. And this is the basis of all of the guarantees of safety that we have. And therefore, every claim of safety that's made by these, this multi-trillion-dollar set of industries is fraudulent. Okay. What am I doing here? Okay. So how do we get our non-thermal effects? How do we get that? And this is my own work, not based on my own experimental work, but in looking at materials, information in the literature. There are 28 different studies. In fact, I've now cited 29 that show that non-thermal effects are produced through the activation of what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. And the evidence for this is that the effects can be blocked with calcium channel blockers. Okay, so these are drugs that are specific for blocking these voltage-gated calcium channels. And so let me tell you a little bit about how this system works. Okay, every cell in our body is surrounded by a membrane called the plasma membrane. Right, that's the thing that separates the inside of the cell from everything outside. And in that membrane are a number of channels that can allow things to flow back and forth across the membrane. These channels can allow calcium ions to flow back and forth, and they're regulated by the electrical charge across the plasma membrane. That's why they're said to be voltage gated. Okay, and so what happens when these are activated by the EMFs is that the channels open up, and you get huge amounts of calcium flowing into the cell. And it's the excess calcium in the cell that's responsible for producing most, if not most of the effects that you get. And so normally calcium levels in the cell are about 1/10,000th of the calcium levels outside the cell. So what does that tell you? It tells you that cells spend a lot of energy keeping calcium levels low, and that's very important for them. So when you get huge increases in calcium, that can cause lots of problems, and that's basically what we're going to show. So that's a very huge stressor on those cells, and let me just say there are other voltage-gated ion channels that are also activated by the EMFs as well. But they have relatively small effects on the cells. So these are the important ones in terms of producing effects. Anyway, all of the frequency, all of the EMFs, all the way from millimeter waves to be used in 5G through microwaves, radio frequency, intermediate frequencies, extremely low frequencies like 60 hertz and 50 hertz from our power wiring, all the way down to static electrical fields and static magnetic fields. They all work by activating these channels, the same target, these huge range of EMFs. So that's very important, and so basically, biology is extraordinarily complex. When you don't know what these EMFs are doing, you're in a situation of incredible confusion. When you know what they're doing, which we do, it immediately clarifies everything, and I think you'll see that in a minute. Okay, so this is a two-dimensional model of these VGCCs, and what you can see here are that there are. It's a structure that has 4 different, very similar things. This thing looks like that thing, looks like that thing, looks like that thing. Right? These are called domains. So there are 4 similar domains in the protein, and each of these cylinders here, the blue ones and the orange ones, are alpha helices. They're a structure in the protein. And the 4th helix, which is the one that's colored orange, has a bunch of positive charges in it. See? Plus, 5 positive charges in each of them. Those are the voltage sensor. They are the structure that detects electrical changes across the plasma membrane and opens the channel. Okay? And what I'm going to tell you is that structure is absolutely extraordinarily sensitive to the electrical forces of these EMFs. And that's why the EMFs activate these channels. This is an old law of physics called Coulomb's law. It was first enunciated in 1784. And what it says is the forces on those charges are inversely proportional to the dielectric constant. This is the dielectric constant. These helices are actually tilted in the membrane, such that those positive charges are in the region of the membrane that are kind of have these fatty tails in it. Okay, and for that reason, the dielectric constant there is very different from what it is out in the aqueous parts over here and over there, and because of that. The forces on those charges are about 120 times stronger because of the effect of the dielectric constant. Okay? Now, there's a second thing which is going on here, and that is that the plasma membrane has a very high electrical resistance. And so according to another law of physics, came from the 1830s, called Ohm's law, the electrical forces, the electrical gradient across the plasma membrane is amplified about 3,000-fold. That means the forces, again, are much higher by a factor of 3,000. Now, when you put those things together, what do you find? You find the forces on the voltage sensor compared with the forces on singly charged groups in the water, in the aqueous parts of our cells and bodies, are 20 times 120 times 3,000 times stronger. That comes out to 7.2 million. So you have incredibly strong forces on this structure. That's why these channels are activated by very weak electromagnetic fields. That's why the industry is wrong when they say the electrical forces are too weak to do anything. And that's why this is the main target of the EMFs, because this structure is so incredibly sensitive to the forces, the electrical forces that are put on it by the EMFs, okay? So what we have here is a situation where the biology tells us what's going on, and the physics tells you why it's going on. So they're both pointing in exactly the same direction. This is an extraordinarily important thing, and it really tells us a tremendous amount about what's going on here. And let me just say, if you look at the last paragraph there, you'll see that there was a paper from Takiya et al. That showed that the isolated plasma membranes, no cells, you can activate these with 3 different microwave frequency, low intensity EMFs. So we know, again, this is a direct impact of the EMFs on these channels. Nothing else is involved. So, so basically, what this tells you is all the claims of the industry are wrong. The stunning sensitivity of this structure, again, shows that safety guidelines are off by something like a factor of 7.2 million. And, we're in a totally different universe now than we were before this. Okay. So how then do you get biological effects out of this thing? And what you'll see here is that, what this shows is, we have a number of frequencies activating these voltage-gated calcium channels, VGCCs. You get big increases in intracellular calcium. That's what this is. And one of the things that happens is you get very high amounts of calcium signaling produced. Calcium signaling is very important in the cell. And so if you have way too much of it, that causes lots of problems. Okay? And then there's a second pathway here that's also very important in producing pathophysiological, that is damaging effects, is that you get big increases in nitric oxide and another compound, superoxide. These two react with each other to form this guy, peroxynitrite. Peroxynitrite is a potent oxidant, and it breaks down to form highly reactive free radicals, which attack proteins and DNA and lipids and all kinds of things in the cell. So they cause lots of problems. You get oxidative stress, and you also get inflammation produced through this. So all of these things can come in and produce lots of pathophysiological effects. So we got lots of things going on here. Okay. So there are many effects that have been found over and over and over again occurring at levels well below our safety guidelines. Effects on fertility of various sorts, effects on the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects in the brain. You get a cellular DNA damage of 3 different types that can cause both cancer and germline mutations. We get apoptosis, which is called programmed cell death, a process very important for producing both the reproductive and neurodegenerative effects. You get oxidative stress and free radical damage. That's involved in essentially all chronic diseases. And you get a lot of endocrine, that is hormonal effects. 15 reviews on that. You get excessive intracellular calcium. We already said that's the cause of almost everything else. 38 reviews on cancer of various sorts. There should not be any question that EMFs cause cancer. There's huge evidence on this. Cardiac effects via electrical control of the heart. There are 9 reviews on that. These are life-threatening effects. In total, there's 197 bodies of evidence on these things, each showing that EMF intensities well below safety guidelines produce important health-related effects. Anyone arguing for the safety guidelines must show that each of these 197 bodies of evidence are deeply flawed. And they don't do that, and they can't do that. I've got a table here which shows some of the details about how these things can be produced. We don't really have time to talk about it, so I'm just going to flash through these. This is supposed to impress you. Yeah, we actually know some other things about this, that's all. Okay? So, anyway, okay. So, sorry about that. Okay, so what? What else is going on? There are several other things which I think where we have substantial evidence, but not the kind of overwhelming evidence that we talked about before. And those include very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias, and I'll talk about those briefly a bit later. They also include ADHD and autism, and I'll talk about, and here we think that it's the late prenatal and early postnatal exposures that are the critical ones. And I'll talk about autism later. And electromagnetic hypersensitivity is another thing that many of us are very concerned about, and I will not talk about that further, but I do think that this is clearly a true sensitivity response. So children are much more sensitive to the EMFs as compared with adults for 4 different reasons. One is they have much higher surface to volume ratios, such that their tissues are more exposed, and specifically their brains are more exposed because their skulls are thinner and they have higher surface to volume ratios in the head. The children have very high densities of stem cells, which are particularly sensitive to the EMFs. So we talked before about the fact that the kinds of cells are important. The stem cells are particularly susceptible to these EMF effects. The developing brain appears to be especially sensitive to the EMFs. We'll talk about that in context of autism. And young tissues have much greater extracellular water content than do older tissues, and this then produces much deeper penetration of the effects. This is discussed by Dr. Deborah Davis in a number of situations. So, okay. Oops. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what about 5G? 5G entails extraordinary amounts of pulsations in order to carry extraordinary amounts of information. It will therefore involve, many nanosecond pulses, trillions of nanosecond pulses, many billions of pairs of nanosecond pulses, so they're going to be very active. Let me just say one thing I haven't mentioned to you is the pulses also act via VGCC activation, the same way as the other EMFs. They're just much more active in doing it. So these are all important, and so these predict then that 5G will be much more active, and then of course there's the extraordinary numbers of 5G antennae which will be used in close proximity to our homes, schools, hospitals, etc., making it essentially impossible for us to avoid these exposures, and so each of these findings strongly argue the 5G radiation will produce vastly greater impacts than do the previously existing devices, and they are also, as you've already seen, producing very large effects. So I'm going to give you 5 examples rather quickly here about the things that I worry most about here with 5G. And each of these 5 examples, I believe, are things that can easily produce our rapid destruction. These are things that are my biggest worries. They're not necessarily in order of which are the biggest ones. So one of them has to do with very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias. And so we've had a big decrease in the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease over the last 10, 15 years. It corresponds at least roughly with the time of these increases, high increases in EMFs. And we're now having people age 30 coming down with Alzheimer's disease. They're still quite rare, but they've never been known to occur before. I mean, these are truly unprecedented cases. We also have digital dementias in people who are highly exposed to Wi-Fi and other digital EMFs, and these occur in even younger people than 30. So these are of great concern as well. Excessive intracellular calcium has essential roles in causing Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases. There are many different reviews that have reviewed the evidence showing that that's true. So again, that's immediately produced by EMF exposures, and there are epidemiological studies on people exposed to EMFs that show that they get higher incidences of Alzheimer's. The EMFs produce large increases in the amyloid beta protein. And amyloid beta has a key causal role in causing Alzheimer's disease. So when you get these high levels, that obviously suggests the EMFs are causing Alzheimer's disease. And now I'm going to get to the two studies that are really critical here. There were two studies done that showed that you could take young rats and expose them to a series of short microwave pulses. And by doing so, you get 100% conversion of what would normally be normal rats to very early onset Alzheimer's rats. So these rats were then examined in more or less the equivalent of middle age, and what you find is they have the usual memory and behavioral problems, that are common in human Alzheimer's individuals, and they also have high levels of the amyloid beta protein in the brain and high levels of oxidative stress in the brain. So they look very much like Alzheimer's rats. And again, all you have to do is give them a bunch of microwave pulses or short pulses, and they 100% of them can get converted to this. So I think it's quite likely that the extraordinarily highly pulsed 5G radiation will produce similar effects in humans based on the kinds of things that I've listed here. And if that's true, then 5G will inevitably produce universal or almost universal very early onset Alzheimer's dementias. We are taking risks of the sort that no rational society on Earth can possibly take, but we are taking them. Let's talk about autism. So the sequence which I'm going to talk about is this one here mainly. Okay, so we have various EMFs, including microwave and millimeter wave frequencies that can activate these VGCCs and produce high levels of intracellular calcium, and those things that can in turn impact the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. Okay, so in the what's called the perinatal period of development in humans and in animals, there is a tremendous amount of formation of synapses between neurons in the brain, in the development of the brain. Okay, so a typical neuron in the brain is linked to 1,000. It's linked through 1,000 different synapses to other neurons. Okay, and it's very important that you get the right synaptic connections. You can make a few mistakes, of course, but that you get the right synaptic connections so that the brain functions properly. What is true is that we know that intracellular calcium has a very important role in autism, and we know that there are 5 different mechanisms that are involved in controlling the formation of the synapses in the developing brain, and I've listed them here. Every single one of these is regulated by intracellular calcium. So when you have excessive calcium in the cell, it will inevitably disrupt the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. And we know that the synaptic disruption is sort of the central thing that goes on in autism, and it then disrupts the connectivity in different parts of the brain, and so forth. So now I want to say that you can also get effects from chemicals that act to increase intracellular calcium along this pathway. It's my opinion that the EMFs are the main driver of the epidemic that we have, rather than the chemicals. And it's my opinion that that's true because many of the chemicals that act along here, there was a tremendous increase in the synthesis of those chemicals during the 30 years following World War II. And yet the autism epidemic didn't really get started until right after that. So I'm not saying the chemicals have no roles. They may well have roles, and they may act synergistically with the EMFs. But I think the main driver of the epidemic are the EMFs for the reason that I just told you. Now, this is something... So, again, whether, I don't think, it is possible that you can argue against this view, but what we are doing is we are taking risks of the sort that no rational society on earth can possibly take. You cannot simply look away from this and fail to act. But that's exactly what we're doing. In fact, we're running as fast as we can in exactly the wrong direction with 5G. So, okay. So let's, okay. So there are also DNA effects. Which, and we know, by the way, that human sperm is impacted by EMFs that we're exposed to every day. The DNA effects are produced in human sperm from cell phone radiation, from Wi-Fi radiation, for example, and so this is a major issue, and the question is, how much are we destroying our gene pool? The sum of all the genetic information that we have that we can pass on to any future progeny, if any, if we have any, and that will determine what their properties are. Okay, so that's crucial. And then there's lowered fertility, and as you can see, there are 25 reviews on that. And you can see there's a whole series of different effects that are produced here, each of which lower fertility. We have reason to think that these are already far along in our technologically advanced societies. Specifically, there was a review published by Levine et al. It's described there. The title is given there in late 2017, which showed that sperm counts have dropped to below 50% of normal in every single technologically advanced country on Earth. Think about that. Reproduction in those same societies has dropped well below replacement levels. And I've been predicting for a while, based on a mouse study that by Magros and Xenos there, that we'll see a crash in reproduction to zero. Okay, is there any evidence for that? I think we're starting to see the first signs of such crashes, and these have occurred in 3 densely populated, high-technology East Asian countries. And let me just say, each of these had among the lowest reproductive rates in the world before these crashes. They were below 60% of replacement levels. Singapore had a 31% drop in reproduction between 2016 and 2017. Macau had a 26% drop. Now, Macau is not a separate country, but it keeps separate statistics as if it were a separate country. South Korea had an 11% drop in reproduction and had another approximate 9% drop in the first half of 2018. The South Korean government's trying to stimulate reproduction because they know that their reproduction levels are too low, and as you can see, they totally failed. It's going in the other direction very rapidly. It's rare that you see these kinds of drops unless you have a war, a famine, or a major economic collapse. So these things stand out as being something that is very, very unusual in relatively good conditions. So it's I believe that it's highly probable that 5G radiation will push many countries over the reproductive cliff much more rapidly, possibly as much as 10 times more rapidly than would happen without 5G. So, so this, again, we are taking risks of the sort that no rational society can possibly take. Okay, this is the last one. So these are the neurological neuropsychiatric effects, and if you look at these, you'll see these are incredibly common in all our technologically advanced societies. I mean, these have become very, very common. We know they're caused by EMF exposures, and I estimate, and underlying this are major changes in the brain structure that are seen in animals. Okay, so so we think it's the brain structure that's the underlying cause of these effects, and I estimated about a year ago that based on how fast these effects accumulate in human occupational exposure studies and also in animal exposures. And animals, let me just say, things in rodents typically go about 15 times faster than they go in our bodies, so you can make at least a rough comparison. I've estimated that our collective brain function would probably crash within 5 to 7 years. And if we have our collective brain function crash in something like that, was about a year ago. So the current estimate would be more like 4 to 6 years. This could be off. These are rough estimates. This could be off easily by a factor 2 in either direction. But that doesn't give us much confidence here. I think, and again, these are completely apart from 5G, completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars so they can drive themselves. All of these other exposures that are already being planned for us are in addition to that, and I believe will greatly speed all of this up. So, I mean, the prediction is very simple. Everything's dependent on our collective brain function. If it crashes, we will go into utter chaos, in which case we're gone. So, okay, summary. I guess I don't really have time to talk about this. I believe that there will be many ecological impacts of these as well. And I don't think we have time to talk about them, so I'm not going to talk about them. But I think there will be massive effects on small animals, including insects, small mammals, birds, and also widely on plants. And that one of the things I think will probably happen is that we'll have gigantic fires caused by 5G because the EMFs make plants produce very high amounts of highly volatile, highly flammable terpenes, which are, pretty much like spraying the plant with a light spray of gasoline. They are very, very flammable. We may have seen the first 5G fires in South Korea, and so those are things that are of great concern. South Korea was the first country to have stated that it's putting out 5G. So, okay. So, I'm just going to go to my summary here. 5G represents threats of a sort that have only been equal once in human history, in my judgment, and that threat was the threat of instant nuclear annihilation. I believe 5G must be stopped. That failure is not acceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Has anyone seen the Big Bang Theory TV show? A bunch of physicists living together? Well, this is the least funny episode right here. So everyone can come up and ask a question at that microphone, but if you don't mind, I'm going to ask the first question. And a number of years ago, my young son asked me if he could have a cell phone. And he asked me if he could hook his laptop up with Wi-Fi. So I'm a scientist, so I went on the internet and looked up the Interphone study. It was the biggest study done to date when I looked this up on cell phones. Being a lazy scientist, I just read the abstract. The abstract said the whole cohort, no significant effects, no cancer effects. But then I thought, this is my son, I better dig a little deeper. So I looked into the further pages of the study and found that they're among heavy users at the time. Heavy user was someone who used their cell phone 30 minutes or more, and there was a 40% increase in ipsilateral cranial tumors. So we fixed that by just connecting his cell phone to the Ethernet, and he can do everything he wants to do on his cell phone with all his friends. And we did the same thing with the laptop. I looked it up and found studies that showed damaging effects on sperm, and my wife insists on grandchildren. So again, we fixed it by putting a wire into his laptop computer, and he uses it the same way he would, except a whole lot faster. So my question is, the last thing I did was I wrote Health Canada and said, look, I found studies that show harm, and I found studies that didn't show harm. So how do you guys as an association determine what to tell the public? And the answer I got back was essentially in their beginning statement and summary statement saying that we use the balance of the evidence. Yes, there are studies that show harm, and yes, there are studies that show no difference, so they use the balance. And it sounds a whole lot to me like climate change, where that's what we get from industry and governments, is that we need to have a huge swing and balance before we're brought to action. So can you tell me, is using the balance of evidence a valid scientific argument?
No, it's not. What you do in science, first of all, is you always look at the strongest evidence first. They claim to have done that, but they don't. And I've just shown you, when you look at the strongest evidence, and in these, each of those situations where we have, huge amounts of evidence, of very, very strong evidence, it shows that the safety guidelines don't work. So, Health Canada's assurance on the safety guidelines is just bogus. I mean, there's simply, there is simply massive evidence that it's untrue. And as I said before, what I did here is really at the core of the scientific method. This is the thing that distinguishes science from everything else. You make predictions, you test those predictions. If the predictions say that if the results do not support the predictions, you throw it out. The safety code 6 should have been thrown out decades ago. Yep. Yeah.
Thanks for your work and your presentation. So obviously 5G needs to be stopped, otherwise it's going to be a disaster. But even if 5G was stopped, we have issues with EMFs.
Right.
In some circles, they talk about non-native EMFs and native EMFs, like sun, the Earth's magnetic field. And in some circles, they also talk about positive therapeutic effects from some EMFs, like a pulsed electromagnetic frequency MAT, which is supposed to off-gas, for lack of a better term, some of the EMF effects. What's your take on mitigation? Because we're still going to be facing EMFs, even if 5G doesn't go. We have electricity all throughout this room right now. And what's your take on some of the positive differences in, say, a PMF MAT or the sun or the Earth's magnetic field?
Okay, that's a lot of questions.
It's
there.
a lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Good and bad.
Let me
Mitigation.
actually. Let me see if I can go back to. Can I go back? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Okay. Let's see. You got that? Okay. You go back to here, and I want to say, I actually have the therapeutic effects on this slide. I didn't mention that because we didn't have much time, but. So the therapeutic effects are quite interesting, and they work primarily through this pathway. And so you do get therapeutic effects of various kinds of EMFs. And they have to be at the right intensity, producing, basically I think what we're looking at here are low-level intracellular calcium increases, and you get this. What's interesting about this is that this pathway downregulates that pathway, and this pathway downregulates that pathway. They work against each other. So if you have initial conditions that favors one versus the other, it tends to have fairly stable kinds of responses. And so, when the industry looks at these things, they say, oh, there are conflicts in the literature, so we just don't ignore it. For instance, we know that you can get both hypertension and hypotension, both high blood pressure and low blood pressure following EMF exposures. But they're done under different circumstances. So there's no conflict. But what you do see here is that, you see differences. Now, with regard, there are many, many ways to try to avoid many of the exposures that we have. And I think that was your other question. For instance, you can carry your cell phone in a pouch that's shielded on one side. So if you put the shield towards your body, at least you're protecting your body while you're carrying it. That's one thing you can do. There are lots of other things you can do. But basically the problem is the industry really has made it very difficult to protect yourself. There are lots of ways in which we could do things much safer. Let me give you an example. Cordless phones, the bases radiate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't need to do that. They only need to radiate when you get a call. That's ridiculous. Cordless phones are designed to be used, usually about 400 feet away from the base. That means they're putting out much, much stronger radiation than they need to 99% of the time that you're using them. But you can't shut it, you can't, all you need is a switch to, greatly decrease it, and the effects would be much, much less. So we do really stupid things. We don't need Wi-Fi for anything. We can do everything wired. Yeah. There is no reason why we have to use it. It's a little less convenient, but it works a lot better and it's much more secure to use it wired. And this is, of course, what Dr. Sheckley is going to tell you about. Wiring is vastly better. And putting Wi-Fi in schools and putting Wi-Fi in hospitals is really an atrocity. So, I mean, there are lots of ways, again, and there are countries that have their cell phone towers limited to levels that are less than 1% of what's allowable in Canada and the U.S. So there are lots of ways we can improve things. Lots of ways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
5 more questions?
With regard to the G5, how can we get our government not to go forward with it? Because there's an election coming up in October the 21st here in our country. Because the thing is, obviously this is all profit motivated because it's big corporations want to make more money and they don't care how it's done. As you can see with the tobacco and Roundup, GM products, et cetera, et cetera. So would it be a good idea to go after the government and really, really lobby and protest like they did in Hong Kong?
Well, I think the fact that you've got an election coming up might be a lucky timing, You can put pressure on them, and if enough people put pressure on them, they'll respond, And so, that may be a lucky thing. Let me just say something about this. There are many, many industries that have corrupted the science and caused problems to, in many cases, millions of people. And they've gotten away with it, basically. Nobody's gone to jail. Those industries, however, did not create existential threats to our survival. 5G is multiple existential threats. In fact, the EMFs in general are multiple existential threats to our survival. So we need to respond to that.
I've heard a justification of public utility workers in rural areas. We have such low density around here, they're never going to put 5G antennas every 100 meters when there's only 1 or 2 homesteads per acre. And nothing's going to be beaming on our forests and wildlife areas from antennas because there won't be any out here. That'll all be in the big city.
Except for the satellites that are being put out.
Right.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And the intensity of those 20,000 satellites cumulative, is that
they are already putting at least what they claim is 5G in smaller cities in the U.S. And so that and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that claimed that 97% of the people in the U.S. will be exposed by the end of next year. So I don't know that I'm going to put, and that's enough to throw the entire country into complete chaos. So, it's, yeah.
Hi. Regarding the protective effects of calcium channel blocking medications, would the therapeutic dose be similar to that one would take for hypertension, or we couldn't all take calcium channel blockers, I know, but...
Well, of course, yeah, the problem, of course, is if people take calcium channel blockers, then they're going to have low blood pressure, and that would be a problem. But at that level, most people would... I know of at least one claim that I think is credible, that the calcium channel blockers can be useful at actually fairly low doses. But the point is, and one point I think needs to be made, these calcium channels have essential roles in the human body. You can't get rid of them entirely. So, you may be able to get some help by using calcium channel blockers, but you certainly cannot block all the EMF effects in that way. And so when we have these extraordinarily powerful EMF effects, it's there really isn't any way of blocking them. You may be able to lower them modestly. But, yeah.
I just wondered because maybe people on those medications are more protected, like my husband isn't bothered the way I am.
Okay.
Possible.
Yeah. No, thanks for the yeah.
One more question, and we'll move on to...
Mm-hmm.
I really want to thank you for coming forward and presenting your information. I've been following this issue for as long as it's been around, and it's getting worse and worse all the time, of course. And I didn't know there were people like you who have done the kind of studies you are, so I'm grateful that you are. Mm-hmm. And is your information going to be available in some kind of written form that we could take and give to our politicians who absolutely refuse to face that anything is bad is happening? They won't deal with these issues. So will you have something in written form that we can use from today?
First of all, I have a number of publications, proper publications that are listed in the PubMed database, and 5 of the 6 of those can be downloaded at no cost off of PubMed. So you just search under my name, Martin Pall, Pall, and electromagnetic, and you'll find those papers.
Okay.
And you can use those. There are other documents that I've made up that are also available on the internet.
Yes.
There's a 90-page document that's there as well, and I've written a document on the safety guidelines, and that's also available.
It's so good what you've done, but I'm absolutely terribly frightened, and most people aren't. 99.9% of people don't know that this is bad. My family, my children, my grandchildren, I try to give the information to them. They just call me a nut. I'm eccentric. I'm weird. Because I learn and I study. Now, my last question to you is, I'm aware of pulsed electromagnetic frequency devices that balance the frequencies and help to eliminate or to balance out or, cancel out the harm. Do you agree that those pulsed electromagnetic frequency devices are useful? And if they are, will they help us with the 5G level? We're all going to be dead in 10 years. They're turning us into something else. There's an agenda here that's strange. It's evil. Yeah. But the question about the PMF devices.
I don't really know enough about them.
Oh, Swiss Bionic?
They may work, they may work to trigger this therapeutic response that I discussed, and that could be helpful.
We have to. A few of us who are following this, if we're going to survive, we have to find technology that's going to help us, and it must be there because the technology is so superior on Earth at this time.
Yeah, I can talk to you about something later that might be somewhat helpful.
Okay, thank you very much.
But
Again, thank you for your work.
you, Dr. Paul. We'll bring up our